Hello, welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to throw a cylinder using 1 pound or 450 grams of clay. So I've got my 1 pound piece down onto the wheel head. Going to be getting this centered first of all. If you're still struggling with centering or want to just revisit that first video that I've done on centering, do feel free to go and check that out now. The reason we start by throwing cylindrical forms when we learn to throw with clay is that the cylinder forms the basis of most basic pottery forms that we're familiar with. So things like mugs, jugs, vases, all of that sort of thing, they'll typically start out as a straight-sided, tall, narrow cylinder, which you can then manipulate to the shape that you want it to be. So, step one, getting the clay centered. Next up, we're going to open this clay up. So there's a couple of ways that you can do this, either using the thumb of your right hand, working down into it, or another way that I tend to use is the 2 middle fingers of my left hand doing that same thing. So what we're aiming for at this stage is we're turning this solid block of clay into something that's going to have a smooth kind of valley-shaped opening in it. So cupping the outside firmly with that right palm and those right fingers. So as we open the clay up, if we don't keep that pressure in from the outside quite firm, the whole thing will spread out wider over the wheel, which we don't want. We're trying to keep it quite tight and compact. So firm pressure with that right hand, right thumb tip here over the center. All my left hand is doing at this stage is pushing down on top of my right thumb just to give it a bit more help, because it does take a fair bit of pressure to work down into the clay. So at this stage my left hand isn't actually touching the clay. So slowly and firmly working down, keeping that thumb tip over the center until we have something looking like this. So the angle that we have here, so we've got this kind of sloping V shape, that has been produced by this thumb, tip staying over the center, and the thumb has just kind of angled itself down until it's meeting the clay at this sort of angle. So as I mentioned, the other way that you can do that, instead of using that thumb, would be to use the 2 middle fingers of your left hand, just working down in that same way to the required depth. So we're aiming to leave about 1/2 centimetre of clay in the base here, and I'm going to check that by stopping the wheel, grabbing my needle tool. I'm going to poke the needle down until it touches the wheel head, run my 2 fingers, or rather run my finger and thumb down until they touch the base, and the amount of needle that we have here illustrates how much clay you have in the base there. So having checked the depth with the needle, I'm now going to open out the base of the piece. So currently it's this kind of valley shape, which we want to turn into a nice flat base, a right angle in the corner and vertical sides. So again, just making sure my hands and the clay have got enough water on them. So still cupping the outside firmly with this right hand here. At this point, I'm going to use the 2 middle fingers of my left hand. They're going to start in the center at the deepest point of the valley. They're pointing away from me, so towards the far edge of the wheel. It's quite a shallow angle that they're meeting the clay at. So it's these tips of my fingers, or the pads of my fingertips here, are what's facing the wheel head. And it's going to be this leading edge of my middle finger that's going to be working sideways through the clay to open it up. So firm pressure from the outside, slowly and steadily moving out from the middle towards that right hand. So once I've gone out as far as I want to with those fingertips, I'm just going to very slowly and steadily run them back and forth over the base. So just from the center out towards the right hand, really taking your time with it, back and forth a few times. So this evens out the surface of the clay, so if you have any bumps or ridges in that base, this is when you would just slowly push through those. So at this stage we've got a nice flat base, a good distinct right angle in the corner. And from here, we're going to close the piece back in on itself. So for this stage, again, wetting the clay, both hands on the outside, so this bottom edge of my hand resting on the wheel, tilted inwards towards each other, so we're making this tent shape around the clay. Just cupping it from the outside and giving it a good firm squeeze back in on itself until it looks something like this. Because we're aiming to throw something tall, narrow and straight-sided, because the wheel is spinning, whilst we work with the clay, it naturally wants to open outwards. By starting with it closed in like this, as we lift up, it's going to open outwards to something vertical. Whereas if we hadn't closed it in here, we'd be starting with something vertical, and then the clay would naturally tend to want to open out to something more shallow and bowl-shaped. So from here, we're going to start lifting the clay. So I have my thumbs crossed, left thumb over the top of the right thumb tends to work best. Because as we're going to lift, we want our right fingertips on the outside, slightly lower than our fingertips on the inside. So by having our thumbs crossed left over right, they're naturally starting to form this shape slightly. So left thumb over right, just using the very tips. I find the middle two fingers work best for me. Just the very tips of them, starting all the way down at the wheel head, right fingertips on the outside corner here, left fingertips on the inside corner here. So to begin the pull, we're going to spend a few seconds just squeezing the clay inwards firmly. So before we start to lift upwards, we're aiming to get this overhanging ridge here, and that's what we're going to pull upwards through the clay, which is going to transfer into height at the top. So making sure there's plenty of water on there before you start each pull. So once we've squeezed in, we're going to start lifting. So just very slowly and steadily pushing inwards and upwards. I find that counting to 10 from the bottom all the way up and off the top tends to work best. And just keeping that pressure and that control all the way up to the rim, and then gently taking your fingers off the rim. So after the first pull, we'd be looking at something like this. We typically pull the clay upwards about 3 times, so we're not trying to squeeze too much out of the clay in one go, or that's where it can start twisting and tearing and generally going wrong. So by repeating this process a couple more times, we're just going to be thinning the clay out a bit more and lifting it through each time. So going in for the second lift, again, thumbs crossed, 2 middle fingertips. You may find that you have to open the clay up slightly to fit your hand into that bottom corner. That's not a problem. And again, just a few seconds firmly squeezing the clay between your fingertips down at the bottom. It will feel thinner than it actually is, so most of the time you will have more clay down there than it feels like you do. And again, lifting, counting to 10. So the right fingertips on the outside are doing most of the work as you lift. The fingertips on the inside are really just there to kind of lead the right fingertips and kind of give something to push against. So in order to keep things tall and narrow, that right hand is really doing most of the work pushing inwards. The hand on the inside is much more passive. So going in for one more pull now. Once we have our cylinder, so out of a pound of clay, aiming for something about this sort of size, we're going to get our wooden rib. So using the flat edge of the rib, we're going to hold it at about 45 degrees against the outside of the piece. This just gives the clay a surface to flow upwards as we work with it. So by holding it halfway between vertical and horizontal, we have the clay flowing up this surface nicely. So here, we're essentially just doing another pull, less pressure this time, and all we're doing is cleaning off the surface, so getting rid of all that soft, sludgy stuff. So all this stuff you can see here, we don't want that on the surface of the pot when we try to lift it off the wheel, because it's going to make it much more difficult to get off successfully. This also compresses and strengthens the clay particles in the wall of the piece, which again will make it easier to get off the wheel when we get to that stage. So in the end, all being well, we end up with something like this. If the rim is at all wobbly or uneven, you can use your needle to chop the rim off, leaving you with a nice flat, level surface. So to do that, I'm going to rest a fingertip of my left hand on the inside, using the needle in the right hand. I'm pointing it in the direction that the wheel is spinning. I'm going to leave about 1/2 centimetre below the rim. If you try and do this too close up to the rim, it starts catching in it and the whole thing just starts tearing and falling apart. So you do need to leave a bit of a space, about 1/2 centimetre as a minimum. Fingertip resting against the inside, just very slowly and steadily pushing through into that fingertip. Once you feel the needle touching that fingertip and this ribbon of clay comes off, you can just lift that up and off and then just smooth over these corners of the rim. Finally, I'm going to use the trimming tool just to take a small amount of clay away from that bottom corner there. So this just gives the piece a nice beveled corner, which gives it a bit of definition. And now we come to lifting the piece off the wheel. So you want your hands to be as clean and dry as possible. So I'm just going to scrape them off on the edge of my plastic tub here. We're going to grab our string, run our finger and thumb down the string to make sure there's no lumps of clay or knots or anything in it. Pulling the string tight, pressing it down onto the wheel firmly with my 2 thumbs, slowing the wheel right down, about as slow as you can get it before it stops, pressing the string firmly down onto the wheel, slowly and firmly chopping through, stopping the wheel, and then all being well, you can lift this up and off. And there you have it. One thing that tends to be useful when you're first learning to throw is chopping things in half like so. So it's by looking at this cross section here that we really learn where things are going well and where they can be improved. When you're first learning to throw, it's quite common to have loads of excess down in the base or in these corners here. So aiming for something more or less like this. So flat even base, a decent angle in this corner here, and then walls that are more or less 1/2 centimetre up from the bottom to the top. So that's it for now. Don't forget to check out our other videos if you haven't done so already. And that's it for now. Thanks for watching.